어디 수루가
꽤 수루가.
뒤죠. 수루.
These tall trees that are all around us, and these are called coastal redwood trees. Coast redwood trees have been around for a really long time. The scientists say they've been on Earth for about 180 million years, give or take a few million probably. But the trees in our park are extra special because this is an old growth redwood forest. And that means that this area has never been cut or logged. It's all original growth. And that is a really amazing thing because almost 97% of the redwood trees have been cut down and are gone. So the fact that we have this beautiful forest so close to a city is a pretty amazing thing. Now, the average redwood in here is somewhere between 500 and 800 years old, with our oldest trees being over 1,100. So the trees in our park are really very old, which I think makes them very wise. I think there are a lot of things that one can learn from a redwood forest, so that's what I have for you today, is a short list of life lessons I thought you could learn from the trees. So lesson number 1 is to stand tall and proud. Redwood trees are the tallest trees in the whole entire world. They are the tallest living organism. The tallest redwood in our park is a little bit further upstream from here, kind of near Bridge 3, and that redwood tree is just about 268 feet high, or about 80 meters. But if you were to go further north in California, you might notice that the redwood trees get even taller. The tallest redwood in the world is almost 8 hours north of here in Redwood National Park, and that redwood is just under 380 feet, or about 115 meters. So the trees in our park are really only 2/3 of their growing potential. Lesson number 2 from the redwood trees is to live in a cool place. Redwood trees only grow along the coast of California. They go as far north as Oregon, and then as far south as Big Sur, Monterey area, and then they only go about 30 miles inland. They live in this really specific stretch of land because they really like the weather here. Who wouldn't? They love sunshine, and they love fog, and they love rain, but they do not like snow. It never snows here, and they also don't like too much intense heat, so it never really gets that hot here for that long. They're pretty picky trees, and that's why they're not really found anywhere else in the world, because they prefer this Mediterranean climate that we have here. You may have heard of a tree called the giant sequoia. The coast redwood and the giant sequoia are different trees, but they are related. So they're in the same family, but it's a different genus and a different species, and there are no giant sequoias here.
Oh, no.
I know. So the sequoias only grow a couple hours east of here in the Sierra Nevadas of California. And that includes places like Yosemite National Park, Sequoia Kings Canyon National Park. And the sequoias are famous. They are famous because they are the largest trees in the world in terms of width or volume. But the redwoods are the taller and therefore the better tree. Lesson number 3 from the redwood forest is to support members of your community. And the trees do this with their roots. So we're standing on a boardwalk surface, but in a minute this trail transitions into either asphalt or dirt. And on those paths you might notice that they're real bumpy and you might trip, so be careful. But the bumps are the roots, the redwood roots trying to break through the surface. So you know that the trees can be 200, 300, almost 400 feet high, but their roots only go down into the ground 6, 8, feet deep. They are really shallow for how tall the tree is. And it's sort of like saying if a tree was my height, 5'4", then the roots would only be the length of my big toe into the ground. And with that knowledge, you might think that the trees must just fall over anytime there's a windstorm or an earthquake. But looking around, you can see they haven't really done that. So rather than going down, the roots go really far out. And they can spread out 50 or even 100 feet from the base of the tree. And then they sort of reach for neighboring trees' roots and they kind of intertwine. They're basically holding hands underground. And this is how they support one another, because it does get pretty windy in here. Even maybe now you can look to the tops of the trees and kind of see them waving back and forth. Subtle right now. And they don't usually fall over because they are holding hands. Lesson number 4? Yep. From the redwood forest is to grow a thick skin. Redwood trees have really thick skin, also known as bark. And on a really big old redwood tree, that bark can be up to a foot thick. So 10 or 12 inches on the biggest of trees. The redwood behind me, this is a really great example. We think this redwood is somewhere between 600 or 900 years old. And it has beautiful bark. You can see the deep furrows and ridges that go all the way up the tree, and you can tell the bark sticks out several inches in places on this tree. So that bark is a really great protector just based alone on the thickness, but also the texture. It's kind of unique tree because of the texture of that bark, I think. If you get a chance to touch the tree safely from the trail, you might notice that it's got kind of like a quirky, squishy feel to it. And it's because the bark is made up of these long, hairy, fibrous-y pieces, and it really helps insulate and protect the tree and act as a sort of a sponge in the winter, holding all that water in. But the redwood, there's two main components of a redwood that's allowing these trees to get to be so tall and old, and the thickness of the bark is one thing, and the other is something called tannin, or tannic acid. Tannin is a chemical compound that's found in a lot of plants, and then a lot of byproducts of plants, and you may have heard of tannin in things like coffee, tea, red wine has tannin. The redwoods just have a real high concentration of it, and tannin is what makes a tree resistant to things like fires, insects, diseases, and rot, which means that there are no known killing diseases for a redwood tree, which is amazing. Most trees are susceptible to a beetle or a blight or a fungus or a rust, but there's nothing we know of that is naturally killing the redwood tree, with the exception of wind. The fifth and final life lesson from the redwood forest is to surround yourself with family. There are two ways that redwoods do that, two ways that they can reproduce. One way is from a seed. So you know that a pine tree has a pine cone. A redwood tree has a redwood cone. They do not have any pine cones because they are not a pine tree. This is a redwood cone, actual size. It's tiny, like the size of an olive, and you may have expected to see something a little bit bigger. If you've ever seen like a sugar pine tree, sugar pine cones are like 2 feet long. They're really, really big. So you might have thought that a redwood cone should probably be like even bigger, but it's not. To make up for such a small size, the tree will produce thousands of these cones, and then each cone can hold up to 80 or even 100 tiny little seeds stuck in there. And then on a windy day, usually in the fall, the seeds drop out and they float to the ground. And then the seeds sort of cross their fingers because it's kind of a rough life to be a seed. The seed has to fall onto freshly exposed mineral soil. It has to have sunshine and water, and nothing can step on it and crush it. Nothing can eat it. And nothing can put it in their palm pocket, take it home with them to Iowa. And maybe if all those things work out for that tiny little seed, it will grow into a full-size redwood. But that is super rare. We think it's so rare that only 1 in 10,000 redwood seeds grows into a redwood tree. And we think roughly 10% of the redwoods in this park were even grown from a seed in the first place. So you're not going to see very many seed-grown trees here today. But there is one really great example you can see behind you, right over here. On the other side of the boardwalk, there's a big tall redwood. And we think that redwood was grown from a seed because there's no big redwoods really close to it, sort of like off on its own, growing independently. But the other 90% of the redwoods in this park were grown a different way. And they were grown from something called a burl, B-U-R-L. You can see a burl on this tree about 50 feet up. It's just past that first branch. There's a black warty looking growth. You probably can't see it, that branch is not bothered. That is a burl, and a burl is a mass of dormant buds, B-U-D-S. A bud is, of course, what grows at the end of a twig, and in the springtime, buds get bigger, or like right now, and eventually they're turned into a leaf of some sort. But the buds inside of this burl, when they tried to grow, they got trapped. And then they created this weird swirly pattern as they kept moving and producing more and more dormant bud tissue. Until eventually the burl's job was to just sit up there attached to the tree and wait. And it's waiting for something to happen to this tree, some kind of a stress or maybe an injury. And when this tree gets stressed out, that burl could sprout a redwood directly from it. And when a tree sprouts from a burl, it has the same DNA as the parent tree. So it's actually a clone that might sprout out of there. But the burl you see is unique. You don't see them very often. I don't think you can see any others in this neighborhood because most of the time the burls grow underground along the roots, and you never see them because they're underground. So what usually happens is this. Pretend that I was a tree and I was growing here in the forest, and something happened, some kind of a stress. And a stress, you might be wondering, what stresses out a redwood tree? Well, a lot of things. Weather, so California's been in a drought for the last 2 or 3 years. That's probably stressing out the trees. If we happen to get way too much water for a couple of years, that would stress out the trees as well. A big old windstorm knocking off a big branch would stress me out if I were a tree. But what's actually quite common in our park is too many curious people hugging me and stepping on my roots and picking at my bark. And I got stressed out, as you might too, if you were a tree. And so my burls that are growing underground along my roots, they know that I'm stressed out and they want to help. So their response is to actually sprout little baby redwood trees. So everywhere that you all are sitting and standing might be little baby redwood trees sprouting off all around the parent tree. And eventually the parent tree will go on to die and decompose. And then my nutrients would be recycled back into the soil as food for the baby redwoods. And then you'd be left with a circle of redwoods called a family circle. So sometimes they're big circles like this, and sometimes they're smaller circles, and then sometimes they don't get the memo about the family circle, and they'll form sort of a family blob, like Exhibit A behind you. Now if you look at the base of that redwood, it looks like one big fat giant tree, but if you look up just 15 feet, you can count 5 separate trunks there. So these trees are growing so close together that you can assume they're growing from the same parent tree, they're sharing the same root system, and they're sharing the same DNA. So genetically, that is one tree. But physically, you can obviously see like 5 trees there. So what probably happened is maybe 400 or 500 years ago, pretend that you were standing here 400 or 500 years ago, looking at this tree. I think you would have only seen 2, maybe 3 redwood trees growing independently of one another. And as they got older, they got wider. And they continued to get wider until eventually they kind of ran into each other. And then redwood trees are real stubborn. So they kind of just fused together and grew around each other instead of like falling over. So this is what we call a family circle. And I think it's sort of fun to look for other family circles as you continue your walk. I think there's a lot of things that you can learn from a redwood forest, even beyond my list of 5 amazing things that you will never forget. If you have any questions, I can try and answer them, or if you need any trail suggestions, I can do that too. Otherwise, enjoy your afternoon, and thank you.